Right now, the World Cup is happening. 48 teams, 16 cities, 3 countries, 6 billion people watching. And in the middle of all of it, FIFA is running the most profitable operation in the history of sport. $14 billion. That is what FIFA projects it will earn from the 2026 World Cup. One tournament, 4 weeks, $14 billion. To put that in perspective, in 2010, the World Cup generated $3.7 billion. In 2022, $7.5 billion. In 2026, $14. They doubled the revenue in one cycle. Not by playing better football, by understanding money better than anyone. My name is Maya. I spent years building quantitative models for hedge funds, and when I look at FIFA, I don't see a football organization. I see a masterclass in financial engineering. So today, I'm going to run the numbers. Where does $14 billion actually go? Who are the real winners? And what does it mean if you're thinking like an investor? Let's start with the money coming in, because FIFA's revenue model is unlike anything else in sports. Television rights. That is where 43% of FIFA's revenue comes from. Roughly $6 billion, just for the right to broadcast matches. Think about that structure for a second. FIFA owns the content. They don't build the infrastructure. They don't pay for cameras, studios, or distribution. They just sell the rights to people who will. In the US alone, Fox and Telemundo paid approximately $400 million for broadcasting rights. That's one country. FIFA licenses those rights to 200 countries simultaneously. Second biggest revenue source, sponsorship. $2.5 billion from companies like Adidas, Coca-Cola, and Visa. These aren't donations. These are calculated business decisions. Every sponsor pays FIFA because the math works for them. 6 billion people watching means the cost per eyeball is extraordinarily low. No other media event on Earth delivers that kind of reach in 4 weeks. Third, hospitality and tickets. Combined, another $2.5 billion. FIFA doesn't just sell tickets, they sell hospitality packages, premium suites, VIP experiences, at prices that most people would consider insane. A corporate hospitality package for the World Cup final runs between $15,000 and $80,000 per seat. So you have $14 billion coming in: broadcasting, sponsorship, hospitality, licensing. The question is, where does it go out? FIFA distributes approximately $1 billion in prize money. Sounds enormous. Until you run the math. The team that wins the World Cup receives $42 million. 26 players in the squad. Divided out. That's about $1.6 million per player. Before taxes. Before agent fees. Before club deductions. Net per player after everything. Roughly $800,000. That's not nothing. That's real money. But consider this. Kylian Mbappe earns more than that in 3 weeks at Real Madrid. The World Cup winner's prize is essentially a nice bonus. Now what about the teams that lose early? A team eliminated in the group stage, going home after 3 games, takes home $13 million. Divided by 26 players, $500,000 each, before everything. Net per player, roughly $250,000. Here's something most people don't realize. The clubs, not FIFA, pay the players' salaries during the World Cup. Manchester City, Real Madrid, PSG, they keep paying their stars while those players are competing for their countries. FIFA pays the clubs a solidarity contribution, about $250 million, distributed among the clubs who released players. For a club like Manchester City that released 15 players, roughly $10 million. For a month of risk, injury risk, fatigue risk, to players worth hundreds of millions. But here's the real number that puts everything in perspective. $1 billion in prize money out of $14 billion in revenue. That's 7%. FIFA distributes 7% of total revenue to the teams competing in the tournament. The players who make the product possible receive 7 cents of every dollar. Meanwhile, FIFA accumulated $5.7 billion in financial reserves by the end of 2025. Money sitting in Swiss bank accounts, earning interest. Now, is that fair? That's a different question. What I can tell you quantitatively is this. Any other business operating at this margin would be called extraordinarily efficient. FIFA keeps 93 cents of every dollar it earns. It is technically a non-profit organization. Let that sit for a moment. Let's talk about hosting, because while FIFA collects $14 billion, somebody else pays for the infrastructure to make it possible. Canada's Parliamentary Budget Office estimates that hosting the World Cup will cost Canadian taxpayers over $1 billion. That's direct costs: security, transportation upgrades, public services, stadium modifications. The United States is estimated to have spent over $500 million in public funds. Mexico, several hundred million more. Combined host nation public expenditure, somewhere north of $2 billion. FIFA's financial contribution to host nations in return? Approximately $100 million, combined, for all three countries. $2 billion in, $100 million out. The argument FIFA makes, and host nations accept, is that the economic impact exceeds the direct costs. Tourism, hotel occupancy, restaurant revenue, global brand exposure. And for some cities, that's true. For others, the math is considerably less flattering. Brazil 2014 is the case study everyone should study. Total cost, $15 billion. 12 stadiums built or significantly renovated. Some in cities where football was not historically popular. Manaus, a stadium that cost $300 million in the middle of the Amazon rainforest with one football team in the 3rd division. It hosted 4 World Cup matches. It now regularly sits at less than 20% capacity. Qatar 2022 took this to an extreme that defies quantification. An estimated $220 billion in total infrastructure spend. Not just stadiums. Entire highways, metro systems, hotels, and a new city were built. Qatar was betting that the World Cup would transform its economy permanently. The jury is still out on whether that math will ever work. The pattern is consistent across every World Cup. Host nations pay to build infrastructure they may not need. FIFA earns the revenue. Taxpayers inherit the stadiums. But here's the counter-argument. And it's worth hearing. The US doesn't need stadiums. Most venues already exist. The NFL and college football infrastructure in America means minimal new construction. Dallas, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Miami. These cities already have world-class facilities, which means the 2026 World Cup may actually be the first tournament where host nations come out mathematically ahead on the deal. That's genuinely different, and it matters. With 48 teams instead of 32, more games, more cities, more tourism days, the economic activity is genuinely larger. The Oxford Economic Analysis projects positive net impact for U.S. host cities specifically. Not because FIFA changed, because the math changed. Now let's follow the money to where it actually compounds. Because the biggest financial winners of every World Cup aren't the players, aren't even FIFA. They're the companies sitting around the edges. Adidas and Nike together generate approximately $3 to $4 billion in World Cup-related merchandise revenue during a tournament cycle. Jerseys, boots, balls, apparel. The England jersey alone typically sells over 1 million units during a World Cup cycle, at $60 to $90 retail. Adidas supplies 12 national teams in 2026. Nike supplies 10. Every time a camera captures a swoosh on the pitch, that's marketing worth hundreds of millions that they don't have to buy as ad space. Historical data shows Adidas revenue spikes 4 to 7% in World Cup years versus non-World Cup years. For a company with revenues over 25 billion euros, that's a meaningful delta. Television networks are the second big winner. The broadcasting rights they pay FIFA aren't charity, they're an investment. Fox Sports estimated World Cup ad revenue of over $600 million for the US broadcast alone. They paid $400 million for the rights. They net $200 million in pure advertising revenue, in addition to the brand value of carrying the most watched event on Earth. That's a 50% return on a 4-year investment. Most hedge funds would kill for that IRR. Third winner, the gambling industry. Over $40 billion is wagered globally on the 2026 World Cup, legal and illegal markets combined. Sportsbooks report their highest single-event volumes during the World Cup. Margins on sports betting run between 5 and 8%. At $40 billion in volume, $2 to $3 billion in profit for the house. Every single tournament. And then there's the travel economy. Airlines, hotels, and hospitality report 8 to 15% revenue increases in host cities during tournament months. In 2026, with 16 cities across 3 countries, that economic lift is distributed across a massive geographic area. Economic models estimate between $3 and $5 billion in incremental travel spending. That flows to hotels, airlines, restaurants, rideshare, a diffuse but real economic stimulus. Let me put the full picture together. FIFA, $14 billion in revenue. Sponsors, $3 to $4 billion in merchandise upside. Broadcasters, $2 billion in net profit globally. Gambling operators, $2 to $3 billion. Travel economy, $3 to $5 billion. The World Cup doesn't generate $14 billion in economic value. It generates closer to $25 to $30 billion, when you count the full ecosystem. So what does this mean if you're thinking like an investor? There's a documented phenomenon called the World Cup effect in financial markets. Academic research found that when a country's national team wins a major football match, their stock market rises an average of 0.5 to 1.5% the following day. And when they lose, the effect is asymmetric. Losses produce a drop twice the magnitude of the gains. The takeaway isn't that you should trade on football results. The takeaway is that sentiment moves markets. And the World Cup is the largest coordinated sentiment event in human history. 6 billion people emotionally invested simultaneously. That's a macroeconomic variable that most models simply don't account for. From a more practical standpoint, there are specific sectors that reliably outperform during World Cup years. Sportswear companies, media conglomerates, consumer discretionary. The data shows consistent outperformance in World Cup years versus off years. But here's the nuance that most people miss. The World Cup effect is largely priced in by sophisticated investors before the tournament begins. Adidas stock doesn't spike during the tournament. It rises in the months before, as expectations build. By the time you watch the opening match and think, I should buy sportswear stocks, the institutional money moved 6 months ago. This is the central lesson from every World Cup cycle. The moment something becomes obvious, it's already priced in. In markets, in business, in sport, the edge goes to whoever sees the opportunity before the crowd does. FIFA saw this 40 years ago. They built a content monopoly. They own football's most important events. They sell that content to the highest bidder. They keep the reserves. They pay the minimum they must. And every 4 years, they double the revenue. What's the lesson for regular investors? 3 things. First, own the infrastructure, not the event. FIFA doesn't run football, it owns the rights to it. The companies that own irreplaceable content, sports rights, platforms, standards, tend to outperform over time. Second, understand where value actually concentrates. In the World Cup ecosystem, it concentrates at the top of the value chain, with whoever controls access. That's FIFA. That's the broadcasters who secured rights cheap when demand was lower. Not the players, not the host cities. Third, sentiment cycles are real. The World Cup creates a 4-year cycle of attention and emotion around football-adjacent businesses. If you understand where you are in that cycle, you can position accordingly. Not as speculation, as systematic allocation. That's what separates quantitative thinking from just watching the game. Right now, as you're watching the World Cup, 6 billion people are focused on the football. The people who built the financial architecture around it are focused on something else entirely. They're watching the money. Not because they don't love football, but because they understand the most important rule in any game. Know what you're actually competing for. Next video, I'm going to break down something much closer to home, the habits that rich people use, that quietly compound wealth year after year. Most people think they're boring. The math says otherwise. If this changed how you see the World Cup, leave a comment. Tell me what financial rabbit hole you want me to go down next, and I'll see you in the next one.